Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of OK Zoomer. I'm your host, Aaron Lichtig, Xometry guy and former Jeopardy champion, and I'm here today with Mike Vasquez. Mike is the CEO of 3 Degrees, a 3D printing consulting and technology company, and he's also the host of the podcast called 3 Degrees Discussions. Welcome, Mike. We're excited to have you on today.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be on the show.
So, Mike, how did you get into 3D printing to begin with?
Sure. So that happened in the early 2000s. So I'm a materials engineer by background. And the way I got into materials was I loved playing baseball. I played baseball all the way up through college and even play now in Chicago in some kind of amateur leagues. And one of the things that I was seeing, I love looking at catalogs. Every year they come up with like the new gear and this is like before internet, right? This is like hand catalogs you get sent to the mail. And every year, as a baseball player, you see what the new bats would come out. And one year it was aluminum, one year it was graphite, one year it was carbon fiber. And so I was kind of thinking to myself, like somebody somewhere's job is making baseball bats and coming up with cool materials. And so that's kind of what led me into engineering. I like chemistry, I like math, but I like the applied stuff as well, something I could actually see. And that led me to MIT, where I did my undergrad. And while I was there, also kind of being on the baseball team, I kind of got to know this research group called the Sports Innovation Lab or Sports Innovation Group at MIT. And so they were doing projects with Rawlings and a bunch of other companies looking at applying technology and engineering in sports. And so I really got into that as a passion, and like being able to like physically touch and feel what you were doing in the classroom was really exciting to me. And so I thought I wanted to do something in designing baseball bats. That was actually my first internship. I worked at Easton Sports out in LA, like designing bats as a sophomore.
What kind of bat did you design?
It was one of the carbon fiber kind of bats that they use. I forget exactly what it was called, but I was responsible for a lot of the testing of it, and got to test some bats that exceeded specs, and so it made you look like Babe Ruth. It was awesome. And so kind of long story short, as I was getting more and more into the sports and engineering side of things, I did an internship in the UK at this university called Loughborough, which is about an hour north of London. They're known kind of for more than two things, but kind of the first big thing is they're kind of the UK leader in sports and probably world leader in sports engineering research. They have the Sports Innovation Lab, that Sports Technology Institute, that I spent a summer at. And there, as well as kind of sports, like they were the world leader at the time of 3D printing research at the production scale. So they had 2 metal machines, multiple polymer powder systems, and this is like early 2000s. It's the home of kind of the invention of the high-speed sintering system, or the MJF system that HP uses now. And so a lot of technology was being developed there, and I got to know some of the folks in that group, and really had a passion for 3D printing, and happened to kind of turn it on. Also turn it into some sports related research, first with a shoe company, New Balance, and then ended up kind of doing a PhD later on after MIT at Loughborough University. So kind of transferred across the pond, and was looking into how do you develop new materials for powders, or new materials for polymer-based and metal-based powder systems. And that was applied to Burton snowboards. So they were looking at kind of developing some elastomer material. So it has this kind of sports thread and kind of 3D printing thread, but kind of the real underlying kind of push for me was kind of twofold. One, I liked the hands-on, like seeing things kind of come to life in a short amount of time. And also the challenges that appealed to me in 3D printing were not just the materials aspects, which, as you know, there's no shortage of, right? You can talk to anyone in the space. Like, ask them what their top problems are, it's going to be materials as one of top two or three. But I also was really interested in, having worked in a number of these labs at this point, certainly at a number of facilities, is kind of the people and implementation challenges that you see with the technology. You have to find a business case, you have to train people, you have to make the economics work, you have to think about recycling and scale up and all of that. So I thought, like, hey, there's a career here because there's no shortage of problems to solve.
Awesome. Now, this has been a very interesting year for many industries, but in particular for 3D printing. What trends do you see that started to arise this year that you think are going to continue into 2021? Or what are some of the new things you think are going to pop up next year that we didn't see as much of this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about 3D printing is it hits so many different industries, right? So, I mean, aerospace, commercial, especially, like, took a beating, or is continuing to take a beating, in terms of customer base and people taking flights, and so they've probably been kind of hurt in different ways than, let's say, medical, where there's a lot of push for PPE development, or just companies starting to explore new distributed manufacturing systems. I think the trend that I've seen really is that it's accelerated people thinking about kind of these broader topics of supply chain remanufacturing. It's kind of put a really fine edge on that, as, okay, like, everybody saw, who is in the world, right? And everyone's at home in March and April, that there are some products that can be hard to get if certain countries are shut down or certain parts of the economy are shut down. And that has ripple effects throughout any business that makes things or assembles things, or whatever it might be. And I think it's forced organizations to re-examine, to some extent, what their supply chain looks like, and evaluate, are there different ways to manufacture something or have things more on demand. And so at a high level, I think CEOs and leaders of engineering organizations are trying to understand that more. But I think at the same time, the 3D printing industry has really kind of risen to the challenge in many different ways to support first responders, healthcare workers. We worked on a project looking at ventilators and redesigning that for a lower cost option for developing countries early on in the pandemic. But I think it's maybe accelerated some use of the technology, but I think at the same time, it's accelerated people's understanding of the limitations of 3D printing, where you get it's not a one size fits all tool. There are limitations in terms of how you can test a part, or how safe it is, or how do you even think about manufacturing it in a distributed way, where you have different machines, different materials, maybe making the same product. But there are certainly risks. So I think in some ways it's maybe shown a bigger light on that issue there.
You work with a lot of companies in a consulting role at 3 Degrees, but you also now have a software tool. What does that tool do?
Sure. So that tool is called Trace. And what we were finding so I started the consulting company about 8 years ago. And it's been in the last 2 years that we've really been looking at kind of the software tool Trace, really from the perspective of, as companies think about scaling up and going into production additive manufacturing, one thing that gets lost is the kind of technical data that's generated for each part. And again, as you know, there's not just the printing aspect of any part. There's design elements that go into each component. There's materials and material specifications. There's post-processing. There's inspection. And all that data kind of lives on these different islands. I mean, most of it's in Excel. We did this like 90-person survey of big and small 3D printing organizations, and found kind of that Microsoft Excel is by far the most used 3D printing software in the market. So I always joke that they're the biggest software company in the space, and so it's easy. I mean, anyone can set it up and kind of get some stuff going, but it's not really easy to kind of transfer data between kind of different formats. And so what kind of spurred the development of Trace was kind of addressing that problem and trying to make a tool that allows users to document each step of the workflow, define their workflow so that it maps the standards. So if you're doing DMLS metal printing for a medical implant or an aerospace part, that you can have an outline that the technician and your materials engineer and designers can all follow and kind of input data at that specific point. And then we also grab a lot of machine data. So we're partnered with companies like Renishaw to actually retain data from 23 different sensors in their printing platform, and can connect that to the materials and your inspection data so that you have this really nice, robust traceability report for each part that you're making, each build. And you can keep that in perpetuity, but also learn from what is you're seeing from the sensors, from material usage. You can make tweaks, or you can start to see earlier on if there are issues in your O2 content of your machine. And you can start to say, okay, we may be leaking in a gasket. We may have some other issue that we're going to pause these builds. We're not going to scrap them, but we're going to kind of take a closer look at what the performance of the machine is, or that particular build, to make sure that we don't have to do recalls or have to scrap an entire titanium build, which could cost $5,000-$10,000 just to start it. So you start to kind of really harness that data in a way that's accessible for not just big companies, but we're working with some small, medium-sized companies as well as they start to scale up and be suppliers for the Air Force and DoD and other aerospace and medical suppliers, to kind of really bring that supply chain up to a level that's sophisticated and has good data generation and maintenance.
Excellent. And if anyone is interested in that software tool, they should check out your website or reach out directly to you.
Yep, they can reach out directly to me. We've got some case studies up on our website, traceam.com or 3degreescompany.com. Either of those links will give some more information.
Sounds good. And Mike, you are also a podcast host yourself. You do a really good podcast called 3 Degrees Discussions. Greg Paulson from Xometry will be on an upcoming episode, so make sure to check that one out. How did you get into podcasting, and why did you decide to use that as a way of reaching out to people and teaching them about additive manufacturing?
So this also has a sports link, because 3 Degrees Discussions is actually my second podcast. So when I was doing my PhD in England at the Sport Technology Institute, a friend of mine who was also kind of in the same program, named Henry Hansen, and I were kind of 2 years into our PhD and like, hey, what are we going to do after this? And we wanted to figure out, because there's not like a career fair like for sporting goods companies. And so kind of selfishly, like, how do we start to talk to companies that we might want to work with, or startups that we're interested in? And so we started a podcast called the Sports Technology Podcast. We did about 90 episodes, I think, for that, and had about a 10,000 person listener base, and kind of got busy. We went different ways, and he's now at Adidas. But that was kind of our first foray into podcasting. And we really enjoyed it, kind of getting the stories of how people get into their career, find it. And I wanted to take that kind of same kind of approach and learn about people's careers, and share that with listeners or students or people looking to change industries to hear more about what 3D printing is, directly from kind of people that are living it and breathing it every day. Because I think if you're in a college program, if you're in a high school, a trade program, or even thinking about changing careers in manufacturing, it can sometimes be hard to get access to see some of the bigger equipment or learn about these different career tracks or who's doing interesting stuff, if you're not kind of living it, breathing every day. And I wanted to give kind of some more perspective, or kind of stories along those same lines, so that people who might be thinking about the industry could learn a little bit more.
It's a great idea. It's a very creative way of getting yourself to be known within that industry segment.
Yeah. And I think I've had a great time kind of sharing a lot of the stories of other companies, and Greg was great talking about Xometry, and we've had professors from MIT and leaders from Cummins Automotive and a number of different companies kind of come on the podcast and tell us about what their perspectives are on 3D printing. How can it be leveraged? When's it good to use? What are some of the issues? And it's pretty far-reaching conversations.
Excellent. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today on OKZoomer.
Thank you so much.
And thanks everyone for listening. We will be back next week with yet another episode. Take care, everybody.